Hi, this is Maggie. In this video we're going to talk about fonts in Pygame. Once we know how to render text to a surface using a font, we can add text to our games. For example, we can add dialogue or a scoreboard. The Pygame font module is not guaranteed to be included with a Pygame installation, so you'll want to check for the existence of the font module before using it. And you should have alternate ways to convey any information that's conveyed using a font in case the system your game is running on doesn't have fonts. In Pygame, you can use one of the fonts that's already installed on the system, or you can package a font with your game. You'll have the most control over how your game looks if you package a font with your game. We can see how fonts are used by looking at listing 11.1, which uses both a system font and an external font. Let's run the program first. When we run the program, we see a small window with text. In black, we have Hello World at the top, and then below that, we have Hello World in a weird all caps green font, and then we have in red, bold, italic, underlined, hello again. So we'll look at the program now. We have in the annotations two variables that are of type pygame.font.font, one called sysfont and one called filefont. And then down in the program, after creating a window, the program creates the fonts and renders text with the fonts. To render text with the font means to create a surface that is composed of some text using that font. A font is a typeface and a size, so Cambria 12 point, for example, or Times New Roman 24 point. If you're using a word processor and you pull down the font menu, you'll get a list of names of fonts. But in Pygame, a font is the way the letters are formed and a specific size. This program does assume that the font library is part of the Pygame installation, but you should check to see if it's available before using fonts in a game. So first, the program creates a font using a system font. That's the pygame.font.sysfont initializer, and you can pass in a comma delimited string of fonts. Here we pass in only Cambria, but if we passed in a comma delimited string, Pygame would start with the first font, and if it wasn't available, move to the next, and then through the list of fonts until it found one it could use. The second parameter is the size of the font, which is 36 here. That creates a font object that we can then use to render text. The font object is stored in the variable sysfont. 2 lines later, we write font_surf equals sysfont.render. The variable font_surf is a surface. We are sending the render message to the font we created, sysfont. This will render the first parameter, which is the string hello world, to a surface. The next argument is whether to anti-alias the text, so the program is passing in true, and then the final argument is a tuple, and that's the color. So 000 is black. This returns a surface object, which we stored in font_surf. Okay, now let's look at creating a font that we load in from a TTF or TrueType font file. I created this font called gameasset.ttf, and it's in the same folder as the program. To load that, we use the pygame.font.font initializer and pass in the file path as the first argument and size as the second argument. So that font file, gameasset.ttf, is in the same folder as listing 11.1. As with the system font, the initializer returns a font object that you assign to a variable. So here the variable is file font. We render that in the same way. We send the render message to the font object and pass in the text. We want to render, in this case, hello world in all caps, a boolean for whether we want it anti-aliased, and then the color, in this case, green. Once again, this returns a surface object. We can then blit the surface object to the screen or the background or another surface, such as one representing a scoreboard area. The last part of this program related to fonts makes some changes to the sysfont object. It sends it the set bold, set italic, and set underline messages, passing in true as an argument. This turns on bold, italic, and underlining. If we passed false, that would turn them off. And then we render the font again. Once you've created a font object, you can render it as often as you like. This time we render the text, hello again, anti-aliased, and we pass in red. We blit that to the screen. You can look at the Pygame font documentation to learn more about fonts. For example, you can get a list of installed fonts, so you can check for the availability of a particular font by checking to see if it's in the list. You can also get the dimensions of the area rendered text will occupy. Let's take a look at those two at the console. First, I'll initialize Pygame. Now let's invoke getFonts. If I type pygame.font.getFonts and type return, I get a very long list of fonts that are installed on this machine. I can try Times New Roman in pygame.font.getFonts, and I get true because that is installed on this system. But if I try not a font in pygame.font.getFonts, I get false because that font is not installed, because as far as I know, it's not a font. And I can use size. I'll copy some code from listing 11.1 to create the file font. And then I'll send it the size message with the text hello world. And it tells me 367:37. I can also render it to a surface and get the size of the resulting surface. If I do that, you'll notice that the size of the surface is also 367:37. So it saves me a little bit of time and memory if that surface is not going to be a size I can use. But if I already have a rendered surface, I can also get the size of that surface. So that's probably all you'll need to know about fonts. But again, you can look at the Pygame documentation and experiment to learn more. Have fun with it.